One of the answers is that comes from, I think, our experience with the Apollo moon missions. So if you remember when we landed on the moon, that was televised all over the world, and there was something so captivating about how people in India and Asia and Europe, South America, there's many videos of people watching the moon landing on their TV screens all over the world. And granted, it was a novel experience at the time. It was the first, it was the new. But there was something deeply human about that experience. And when I look at that experience of seeing those videos strung together, there's something about human thriving, about human shared experience that matters to us, right? We feel collectively tied to something. And I think that one of the reasons that we explore as people live vicariously through that, they see something in themselves. Maybe they can't do it, but they see that others doing it and there's meaning to it. So I think there's something important about shared meaning there. And even today when we are, more civilians are going into space, it's captivated another generation who aspire to going themselves. So, you know, it might be something deeply inherently human where we want to explore, we want to see things. I mean, imagine how far we'll go to the edge of the Grand Canyon just to see it. And then we'll turn away and we'll have had that experience. So I think there's something biologically human that motivates us to do that. Yeah, one of our speakers recently, Dr. Stephen Pine, he talked about the great ages of discovery. And what's unique about space is kind of a third great age of discovery, is it's an uncharted territory where there's no existing civilization, right? Before, when we traveled, we would see native indigenous peoples, and sometimes they'd be welcomed, sometimes it would be tragedy and conflict. You know, there's nothing like that. We basically get to decide what civilization we're going to take with us. And the question is, to me, are we going to do that consciously, or are we going to just go and let things develop randomly? There is a conscious effort in the civilian spaceflight community to increase what they refer to often as diversity. They often mean different ethnic backgrounds, I would say that's common, different genders and so forth. So there is a conscious effort to bring together people of different backgrounds who might not ordinarily be together and collaborate. So I think space does have that likelihood of opportunity for bringing something forward. In our conference that we're holding on building a spacefaring civilization, that's really about how do we consciously build something instead of just randomly let it happen, right? Not let it be a tourist attraction where people just show up and then go away, but how do we consciously build something special? And I would say importantly, you know, how do we recognize in our own societies what some of our failings and weaknesses are, you know, and look to space and say, let's not bring those with us. Let's consciously not bring those along. Let's bring the best of those ideas together into space. Yes, I think we will see a mission to Mars in our lifetime, and I think there's two different competing forces. So the ones are the government space agencies, which are going to be very risk averse. Anytime there's a tragedy, they will be worried about their funding being cut or a program being stopped. So there's a great amount of care, which there should be, but we already go to Everest and lots of people die on Everest. Governments don't usually go to Everest, but people do. So it's very possible that a civilian mission, like a SpaceX or an Axiom or something, will be the first to Mars, and that it will be very dangerous, and it's possible people could die on the way, or die when they get there, or have difficulty getting back. One of the plans to take such a mission like that is to fly materials there and leave them in orbit or land them on the surface so that they have resources to last for a period of time before they return, or if there is a delay in return. So that will be carefully thought out, but I think those civilian missions are going to be willing to take more risk, and they'll probably go well ahead of the government programs. They won't have solved everything, and they will accept that risk in going. So that depends if we're talking about selection or, let's say, selecting a crew versus civilians who are paying to go and choosing to go. But I would say in a Mars mission, either way, they're going to be very careful about selecting. And they're going to have to select for engineering skills and medical skills in particular, and related mission associated skills. And then they're going to have a capacity to handle tragedy if it happens. So one of the biggest difficulties of prolonged spaceflight is the feeling of isolation. And if you've ever seen pictures from the Mars rovers of the sky with the Earth in it, it is very tiny. It looks a bit like Mars looks to us, maybe slightly bigger. So when the astronauts leave the Earth's orbit and they start getting further from Earth and seeing it shrinking to a dot, we don't have any simulators, any analogs on Earth to study the psychology of how that's going to be experienced. We think it's going to be desolate and lonely and maybe shocking to be that far away, but we'll have to find out. So the critical thing is going to be behavioral resiliency, the capacity for teamwork and team collaboration and empathy. Also it's a longer exposure to radiation, and so we have some cognitive effects of radiation over that duration of time to think about, well, how does the radiation effects on the brain impact reasoning and decision making and collaboration and emotional stability, and will that come to bear on how the crew cohesion plays out, which might be different in Earth orbit, but that duration on the way to Mars, the radiation and microgravity may take its toll and further impact the behavioral components. So we do definitely have to take these psychological resilience issues very, very seriously and select carefully for that. Yeah, so the twin study was a study of what are called monozygotic twins. So they're identical twins, two twin males. They're both astronauts, Mark Kelly and Scott Kelly. And the goal was to do the first and most comprehensive multi-omics study that had really ever been done. And so our team was part of that, and our collaborators all around the world, and especially Chris Mason's group at Cornell. Essentially, omics is you can think of it in terms of the Human Genome Project, so genomics, but that's just one slice of it. We have other chemical molecules to discover, and it's called transcriptomics, epigenomics, metabolomics, proteomics, the microbiome. So all these omics together means we're measuring really over the course of a year mission hundreds of thousands of biochemical signatures, and then looking at the trajectory of all of those signatures over the 1 year in space and comparing space to Earth. So it's hard to draw very, very strict conclusions from only two subjects, and especially only one that was in space. But nevertheless, we got extensive amounts of data, and we do have real insights that came from it. And so, for example, we've known of the immune effects on long spaceflight. Those were significant and noted. There were definite effects on the skin, and so if you hear Scott Kelly talk about how he felt, it was like if it would burn if you touched his skin, the degree of isolation and lack of contact was really starting to affect him. In fact, he did come back a little bit early. It was meant to be a full year. It was 340 days. We saw some changes in about 8 out of 10 different cognitive parameters, so memory and things like that. They mostly all recovered fairly soon after coming to Earth. You've heard of a problem called space-associated neuroocular syndrome, so that's where eye changes happen in space. He did experience some of that in space, but we knew of that from other missions. And then there were, about 7,000 genes that changed in space. So the genes themselves don't change, but what we call gene expression is what changes. So when our bodies are having to adapt to anything, the genes are either switching on or off, or they're switching up more actively or downward more actively. So when we say there were 7,000 genes, we're talking about they were either more active or less active in space. And that gave us a bit of insight into what are the, quote, space-associated genes. And so that did give us more of a direction to look now for additional features of how the genes change and how spaceflight changes an individual. But the usual things showed up there: bone and muscle, connective tissue. Of course, when the body is going into microgravity, the structural materials that hold things together recognize they no longer have to hold things together in the same way. So those genes start to change. So a lot of it has to do with microgravity. The fluid all shifts up to the upper body into the head, and so pressures can increase inside the skull, inside the brain, inside the jugular vein and the carotid artery. So that's become something we watch very carefully. Separate from the twin study, we did learn from another study that viruses re-express in space. So we all have viruses in our body that are just dormant and sleeping. When you go to space, they very often re-express. They start to be active again. And it's been learned that those who are the most physically fit compared to the least physically fit astronauts have much less of that viral re-expression. So these give us insights into the kind of preparation that we can do as, quote, what we call countermeasures. So if you can do more push-ups than the next person and more pull-ups, that's actually the two main exercises that were associated with a better immune response and less viral re-expression. But I'll just add one thing about the twin study. So that multi-omic study, we've now replicated that for the civilian missions. So the SpaceX Inspiration 4 mission, the Polaris Dawn mission, the Axiom 2 mission that went up this year. So we have all those samples and are running all of those analyses on the multi-omics again, using the same methods. So what that allows us to do is compare something like a one-year mission to a 3-day mission, which was Inspiration 4, to a roughly 2-week mission, which is Axiom. So what that's giving us the ability to do is to say, how early do some of these changes come into play and how bad do they become over time? And then we can start to develop new tools for, now we know we have to measure X, Y, and Z, or new tools for intervention on Earth. Or if they're significant enough, we might have to have the interventions during spaceflight. Yeah, so precision medicine, we could define that as the application of therapeutics or prevention to an individual going into any kind of environment. So our work is in extreme environments like spaceflight and military, high altitude, underwater, the things that most people don't do, and they're harder, more dangerous, and they require better performance, but they also have more risks, so the safety issues come into play. So I'll use an example that probably illustrates this the best. So we all know of the drug codeine, because a lot of people have taken it for pain. Some people take it when they get respiratory problems, some colds and flus sometimes if it's severe. So codeine works because it's converted into morphine. Probably a lot of people don't know that, but that is its mechanism of how it acts. So we can today measure a gene. It's got a cumbersome long name called cytochrome P450-2D6. I won't say that again, but we can measure all those cytochromes. And if you had the 2D6 gene that rendered you a slow metabolizer of codeine, it just wouldn't work because it doesn't get converted to morphine. Maybe 10% does, so it just wouldn't work. So if that was you, and I was advising, and I had your gene profile, I'd say codeine's off your drug list because it won't work. So now let's take another astronaut who's going on a spacewalk tomorrow, and we have their gene profile, and they're what's called an ultra-rapid metabolizer of 2D6, which means they convert about 50% of their codeine to morphine. that means they can get morphine overdose symptoms. So that's slow breathing, low blood pressure, actually respiratory distress, sweating and heavy perspiration, nausea and sometimes vomiting. And it's very distressing. So now imagine that I'm the flight physician and I didn't know that, and now I'm sending someone on an EVA who started to have pain for some reason. I give him codeine, he goes on the spacewalk with morphine overdose symptoms. So we can know that today. We can test that genetics today. We can build a mission drug list out of that today, and we can give that prescription. So we might have 6 crew members going to Mars. Percentage-wise, most will be the regular metabolizers, and you probably have 1 slow metabolizers where you'd say no morphine, and you'd have 1 out of that 10 who's going to be a rapid metabolizer and say it's dangerous for you, and we'd find, and tramadol is another one where you'd say, you know, you can't use that drug. So that's one way that precision medicine is going to be crucial. Another way is with all of these molecular analyses that we do, if we measure the 6 crew members on the mission to Mars, they're all going to have a different profile with regard to many different molecular features. So we would be able to give them all one general package, but then we'd have to individualize to their specific molecular profile. One of the reasons we know this works is with our work with SWAT teams and military special forces and elite athletic teams. We do this on a regular basis, and we find these patterns. We see these every day, and we tailor to entire teams or entire crews, and we follow their performance, their health, their injury rates, and things like that. We know it makes a considerable difference. So it's natural for us to translate that into space flight. Probably less important for short-term space flight, and becomes vital for mid and long-term space flight. Yeah, so I think we can build off that part of what are the lessons and what do those groups look like, or what do they have in common? You know, so astronauts are highly trained, highly selected, and only few get through for a lot of reasons. Probably 8 out of 10 astronauts are military, so they've already gone through quite a selection process, training and preparation. I would say in all of them, they're relentless workers. They're not ordinary people, and so they're willing to withstand a lot of pain and suffering and setback and loss of personal time, because they're very goal focused. And they're willing to outwork everybody else. But with that propensity to outwork everybody else, there's also a propensity to keep going when you maybe should be in a recovery mode or a rest mode, and to push through maybe more severely than you ought to, right? So then there's challenges with recovery, or what's called burnout, overreaching. And so we always have to measure, you know, what is the training and preparation and mission and competition objective? How far do we push that before the health impacts mean we have to pull back? So we're always juggling, how do we enhance performance and do so in a way that's doesn't have negative implications? But that's all part of this evaluation process that we do, and we're always looking for signs of overreaching, signs of burnout. We do behavioral profiling, we do physiologic measures of all kinds, and those signals start to say, yes, now you need to focus on recovery. So there's a lot of corollaries between these kind of elite performers and astronauts. The environments are just all different. You know, a military operation that's acting at 18,000 feet elevation is a severe stress that's different than being in space. And so what we have to do is uniquely prepare them for those environments. And but that's all part of the context. So when we do precision medicine, the environmental context is built into that. And so then we know what unique stressors are going to be part of that. And our experience is the more you can tailor it to the individual and to the environment, that's where we get the best in 2 ways out of any performer. One is we don't suffer the losses in performance that can come with extreme operations. But beyond that, we account for as much as we can for what could contribute to losses, but we try to go above that and build incremental gains in performance. And we've seen that with a wide range of elite performers. And so that's why working across these earth-based domains gives us a good deal of confidence in the methods that we and others have developed that we can now translate into spaceflight and astronauts.